The United States government has increased economic pressure on Cuba, and critics argue that this pressure is so severe that it is harming ordinary civilians. Some commentators describe the situation as a modern form of siege warfare. They believe the goal of the policy is to weaken Cuba's economy to such a degree that the government collapses. The economic embargo against Cuba is not new. It began more than 60 years ago, shortly after the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Since then, the U.S. has maintained restrictions on trade, banking, and investment. However, during the administration of President Donald Trump, these measures were expanded and tightened significantly. One of the most serious areas affected has been energy. Cuba relies heavily on imported oil to generate electricity and run transportation systems. When oil shipments are restricted, the entire country feels the impact. There have been reports of extended blackouts, reduced public transportation, school closures, and disruptions in government services. Flights have been canceled, and daily life has become more difficult for many people. Some Western media outlets have reported that Cuba's economy is in deep crisis and have questioned whether the country can continue under these conditions. Critics of U.S. policy argue that the objective is not simply pressure, but economic collapse. Certain U.S. politicians have openly spoken about wanting political change in Cuba. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has publicly said that he would welcome regime change. Some members of Congress have used very strong language when discussing Cuba policy. Critics interpret this language as evidence that the goal is to apply maximum economic pressure, even if it leads to widespread hardship. Opponents of the sanctions argue that restricting oil and financial access affects 11 million Cuban citizens, not just the government. They describe the policy as collective punishment. Journalists and activists who have visited Cuba have reported that many families struggle with limited electricity, shortages of cooking gas, and transportation problems. Some residents have said they have electricity for only a few hours per day. Others report difficulty obtaining food, medicine, or basic supplies. Supporters of the sanctions respond differently. They argue that Cuba's economic crisis is primarily caused by internal mismanagement and a centralized economic system that limits productivity. According to this view, the government's policies, not U.S. sanctions, are the main reason for shortages. The debate is intense and highly political. Some United Nations human rights experts have criticized aspects of the U.S. embargo, arguing that broad economic restrictions can contribute to humanitarian hardship. Each year, the United Nations General Assembly votes on a resolution calling for an end to the embargo. In most votes, the vast majority of countries support ending it. However, these resolutions are not legally binding, and the U.S. government has continued its policy. The United States also applies what are called secondary sanctions. This means that companies or countries that trade with Cuba could face penalties if they have significant business in the U.S. Because the U.S. dollar dominates global trade and finance, many international companies avoid dealing with Cuba to protect their access to American markets. Some countries, including Russia and China, have expressed political support for Cuba. China has helped Cuba develop renewable energy projects such as solar farms. Russia has discussed sending oil shipments. However, many nations hesitate to challenge U.S. sanctions directly because of economic consequences. Historically, U.S.-Cuba tensions go back to the Cold War. In 1961, the U.S. supported the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in an attempt to remove Fidel Castro from power. Declassified documents from the early 1960s show that U.S. officials believed economic pressure could weaken support for the Cuban government by creating economic hardship. For decades, U.S. policy has aimed to isolate Cuba economically. Some critics argue that this strategy has caused long-term damage to Cuba's infrastructure and development. They say the restrictions limit Cuba's ability to purchase equipment containing U.S. parts, including technology and some medical supplies. Because many global products include U.S. components, sanctions can affect trade even with third countries. Supporters of Cuba point out that despite economic challenges, the country has maintained high literacy rates and universal health care. Cuba has trained doctors who have worked internationally and has developed vaccines. They argue that without the embargo, Cuba's economic performance could improve significantly. Meanwhile, critics of the Cuban government argue that political reforms are needed and that economic liberalization would improve conditions regardless of sanctions. The geopolitical situation is complicated. The United States views Cuba's cooperation with countries like China and Russia as a strategic concern. U.S. officials argue that they are protecting national security interests. Critics say this is an overreaction to a small island nation. The broader question is whether the embargo achieves its intended goals. After more than 6 decades, the Cuban government remains in power. Economic hardship has increased migration, with many Cubans leaving in search of opportunity abroad. Every year, the overwhelming majority of countries at the United Nations vote to condemn the embargo. However, the U.S. retains veto power in the Security Council and remains economically powerful enough to enforce its policy. At its core, this debate is about power, sovereignty, human rights, and economic strategy. Some see sanctions as a necessary tool to promote democracy. Others see them as harmful policies that punish civilians. The future of Cuba depends on decisions made in Washington, Havana, and other world capitals. Whether the embargo continues, is strengthened, or is lifted will shape the lives of millions of people. The situation remains deeply controversial, emotionally charged, and politically complex. What is clear is that ordinary Cubans continue to experience economic hardship, and the international debate over responsibility and solutions shows no sign of ending.